Welcome back. Today on Laps and Legends, we're talking to, for some wild reason, if you have not heard of this ultra runner, Zach Bitter. Zach Bitter is with us and has set one world record and four American records at Desert Solstice. So, in 2013, setting a world record for the 12-hour open, the American record for the 100-mile open with a time of 11:47 bananas. Then coming back in 2015, setting the 100-mile and 100K men's open American record with a time of 11:40. And then in 2019 with the 100K men's American Open track record. Zach, great to have you here with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm always down to talk some Desert Solstice.
Heck yeah. Yeah, you've been here for a few years and I'm sure there's a lot of heart in this race.
Zach,
Yeah,
how
I
many
don't
times?
think there's an event I've done more than Desert Solstice now that I think about it. So,
That's too funny.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, how many times have you been out here?
let's see, 13, 15, 17, 18, 20, and 23, I think. So seven?
Wow, I thought I was a veteran with 5. I'm gonna have to get a few more years in me, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
Ooh.
There's some ones I'd rather not talk about. So if you want to drop it down to five, we can.
We'll pretend.
I have a few of those as well. Cool. Let's talk about your first year out here, 2013. What made you come into the world of track ultras? And obviously 2013 was a really special year with the 100-mile American record and the world record. So just talking a little bit about what made you come and how special that year was for you.
Yeah, that was a fun one. I would say like at that point in my ultra running career, I was at peak ignorance as I wasn't even really aware that track ultras really existed in any capacity that I was really thinking about anyway. So I kind of had learned through a couple other events that like kind of flat, more runnable options were available. And I ended up doing this 50-mile race in Chicago that was as flat as they get and ran pretty fast there. I think it was like a 5:12 50-mile. And then Nick Curry actually reached out to me after that one and said, "Hey, we've got this race out here in Phoenix that is kind of built to sort of chase records. So we'd love to see you come and maybe take a swing at the 100 miles or something like that." I was like, "Cool, yeah, let's do it." So that was sort of the my intro to the event itself, and I went there kind of with a goal of looking at maybe breaking the American record there. So John Olson had just recently broken it, been the first American to go under 12 hours, I think, for 100 miles. So I thought to myself, well, if I can do 5:12 for 50, I can slow down to maybe like a 5:45 for the first 50 miles, and then try to hang on for something under 12 hours. So that was sort of the goal and the strategy for the day. Wasn't even aware there was a 12-hour world record at the time. I found out
Wow.
about that, I think about 90 miles in when Nick came over and told me, like, "Hey, you're
Mm.
slowing down a little bit, but if you kind of keep the momentum and get to 100 miles, stay out on the track because there's a chance you'll pass the 12-hour world record." And that kind of lit a bit of a fire under me, and I sped up a little bit for those final hour and a half or so, knowing that I had more reason to be out there than just the 100 miles.
Wow, cool. Yeah, it's wild, right? As athletes, you get that one little
Yeah.
incentive point and the mindset changes, and then all of a sudden you're moving much faster. That's so cool. So cool.
Oh man. Okay, so I know you've mentioned Don Ritchie as a big influence on your decision to come to a race like Desert Solstice. Can you talk a little bit about Don and that inspiration that you had there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first intro into ultra was through the trails. So I sort of kind of looked at it as a trail sport more or less. And when I kind of actually kind of got into like digging into some of the history of it all, I started realizing, you know what, there was like an era of ultra running that kind of the roads were the dominant one where I mean the fast, so to speak, folks on the marathon and shorter distance stuff, when they did decide to do an ultra marathon, they were oftentimes doing things that maybe more closely resemble Desert Solstice. So kind of checking out kind of the stuff that he had been doing and some of these other kind of guys in like around the 80s time frame, running some of the historic records on a lot of the races at the time. The time kind of led me down that path. So he was definitely an influence.
Awesome. I love that.
Yeah. And obviously now you haven't just ran at Desert Solstice. You've ran other track races, and one of those 6 days in the Dome. For those that are unfamiliar, this is an indoor track facility where Zach went and broke his 100-mile records there. What is like, I guess, maybe some pros or some cons or just some differences that, like, say, 6 days versus the Dome versus Solstice? Like, was there any difference, like you preparing for those or just mentally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what the dome represents is sort of like an extreme of what the track sort of does in general, or some of these timed events where the things that kind of work in your favor also can present some mental hurdles. So when you think of a 400-meter track like you see at Desert Solstice, so controllable, like there's no elevation, everything's predictable. You've seen the whole course after your first loop. You got one person out there handing you whatever you want whenever you want it. If you make a mistake, you're only 400 meters away from remedying it. Really, the only good reason to stop is to use the bathroom. So,
Yeah.
Hmm.
you have a lot of that like kind of logistical ease there, but then you have to be able to mentally sort of tolerate just the monotony of it all. So you kind of have an extension of that at the dome where now you add to that component, all those components I mentioned, the temperature control, where since it's built around a speed skating rink, they keep it at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think humidity is like 30% in there. So it's like optimal running temperatures for something of that intensity. And that's great, but it's also something where you don't even see the weather change, you don't see the sun change, there's no like indication from the environment of any change. So you have just maybe one step further in that kind of like, all right, I'm on this hamster wheel of a scenario going. So you do have to kind of get comfortable with that side of things a little bit too. But preparing for that one, I think, was kind of unique for me because then at that point I was still living in Phoenix, and that race was at the end of August, the year I ran 11:19 there. So I did a lot of my long run development in like triple digits on an outdoor track. So I think going into that event, I probably carried over all the benefits of like increased blood volume from just, training in the heat and things like that into an environment where I didn't necessarily need it, but I was going to benefit from it. So it was probably something that probably helped with a little bit of the logistics of what we kind of find difficult about some of these longer duration events where you're dealing with the fueling and the hydration side of it. Um, on top of it too, I had just had a really good buildup in general. I had been racing pretty well that year. I had my aerobic threshold at about its lowest point in my running career, which I find to be a pretty interesting variable when it comes to these 100 milers, because I see that sort of as like a little bit of the red line where you don't necessarily want to be going over that in any large capacity for both metabolic and just the sheer impact of running when you start getting to the paces that are going to get you to that if it's really refined. So, having a higher ceiling on that was probably something that just made some of those paces that are a little bit underneath it feel a little more comfortable, and the fueling around it also a little more manageable.
Yeah.
And like going, obviously you've set the 100-mile American record multiple times, the world's records before. Have you learned anything on like a fueling standpoint? Like, say, if you go back to 2013 versus, hey, if you were going to go next year to try to set an American record, has that changed? Have you learned anything from the experiences?
Yeah, the way I usually look at it is the more data you can collect on yourself, the better, because there is going to be kind of an individual characteristic when it comes to your fueling needs. There's a lot of, other stuff where you can look into and from maybe some secondary benefits of more fueling than you actually need. But for me, it was kind of, I've tried to simplify it as much as possible where, I've gone into the lab and got my fat oxidation tests done. So I kind of know what my carbohydrate and fat metabolism is at my through the entirety of the intensity spectrum. But again, I kind of usually go back to that aerobic threshold level and say like, okay, whatever my fat ox to carb metabolization at this intensity is going to be generally where I kind of build the structure around my fueling for. So for people that's going to range to some degree, and it's going to be impacted by like your training and your diet to some degree. So for me, I skew a little lower carb in my day-to-day diet. And that's been my approach for pretty much for all of my 100 milers. So I don't necessarily have great data for myself as to like what maybe I would be doing if I were following a higher carbohydrate diet in my day to day. But if it was, I would still go in and get that tested and kind of figure out where that would be. So for the average person on like a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, which is going to be most people, you're probably looking at about a 50-50 split from your fat and carb metabolism at aerobic threshold. So then you can start looking at workload from there in terms of kind of how much energy is going to be required every hour for you at the intensity you're planning to run, and start kind of trying to practice and plan. For me, it tends to be somewhere around like 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour is what I would need to kind of cover my bases on the carbohydrate side of things. So going into these kind of more controlled events, I usually try to kind of hit those. And, there's times where I'll like drift maybe a little bit under it if you're just like, a little less motivated, a little less receptive to fuel. Sometimes I'll feel a little better and go a little bit above it, but it usually kind of ends up averaging out around that number. And if I can get that in, I usually feel pretty strong at the end of the race. So at the Pettit Center, that particular race, I was my fastest at the very end. So it seemed like my fueling and hydration were probably as optimized as I could hope for on that day.
Awesome. Yeah, I love it. Something we've kind of touched on in a couple of our questions, and it's just inherent with this kind of race, but I'd love to talk about some of the challenges that go in with a 24-hour distance. I mean, I've run for 24 hours before because I'm back of the pack, mid pack, but for you fast guys, getting to 24 hours, like that's a whole nother 100-mile ultra marathon. So I'd love if you could kind of walk through some of those major hurdles in the 24-hour race setting. Why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult? And one of those races that you truly do have to engineer and test and, control the variables as much as possible, because we know how races go. But why do you think it's so hard and such a also just intriguing challenge that athletes like you guys love to just go after and try and tackle the best you can?
Yeah, I love this question, partly because I have yet to find anything I would consider success at the 24-hour event. So it's one where I really want to try to solve at some point in my running career, but kind of finding that path forward is something I think I'll have to probably dedicate a lot of focus towards. Because to some degree I've jumped into 24 hours sort of as like, off of 100-mile training, and that hasn't seemed to work great for me. I've done like one dedicated 24-hour build where the entirety of the training was towards that event, but in hindsight, I'm not convinced by the way I did it. It was probably a little too much training in my opinion, and that maybe didn't yield the results I was looking for on event day either. I think what makes it difficult though is when you kind of look at some of the big performances you see out there, there's not necessarily a clear line of like, okay, this is the approach or this
Mm-hmm.
should be kind of the starting point. Because you take someone like Camille Herron, or you take somebody like Nick Curry, people who've put up big numbers in the 24 hours, and their race day strategies could not be different from one another, but they both put up what they would consider big performances for them. Kind of even the same when you get into like Sorokin's world record for 24 hours. It was a pretty healthy, positive split. I think he actually split like 11 hours and 10 minutes for 100 miles in that race. So like he put up a world-class 100-mile race within the 24-hour world record. Yeah, I think it's just like one of those things where when you look at kind of, any other distance, there's usually a little bit more of a clear trend line as to like this is the approach that likely has yielded the biggest numbers or the biggest results, where the 24-hour seems to be kind of a little bit more of a spread between kind of a more like even or negative split type approach versus taking on a pretty healthy chunk of it in the early stages, and then more or less surviving at the end to get to those numbers. And I think my hope with that is sort of that we just see more interest in the event over the coming years, so that we just kind of refine just what is likely going to be the better starting point. But for me, I think I kind of look at it at this point of like I've got some exposures to the 24-hour that didn't go well, so I've got some ideas about maybe what not to do, and then kind of structuring things in a way where I'm avoiding those situations, and hopefully that can kind of highlight what will actually yield a good result for me on race day.
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle because there are so many variables. With an indoor event, there's a lot. There's some fewer variables, but with like Desert Solstice, I mean, of course you have the weather situation, but it's always that 400-meter track, and it sounds nice on paper, but we
Yeah.
know it's not.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
the other for an athlete like Zach, I always like to say it's literally double the duration.
Yeah.
Zach can run an 11, 20, 100 mile, and now he has to be out there for 24 hours. And at least when I was trying to learn more about the sport personally, that was probably it took me years to like kind of like just figure that out. Like, hey, this isn't just running 100 miles and hanging on. Like, Because yeah, like someone like Zach, if he runs 11, 20, 100 mile, it's going to be tough to hang on for another 12 hours. So, I mean, that was a big piece, for me to try to, and I'm no expert at this, but then just trying to figure out like almost any other road race, or like we never see in any other road race these positive splits resulting to like huge performances. So like I try to lean towards, all right, like there's got to be something there. So we probably have to be in some sort of margin of error of positive or negative, and who knows where that margin is. But you
Yeah.
kind of touched on this, Zach, but what do you think? I mean, these events are getting more popular. Not so many trail runners are taking them on. Obviously, Killian gave it a shot a few years back. It didn't go so great for him. Do you think it's like, are we going to see this era? Are trail runners going to eventually like dip their toes in this, or is it just like still on the fringe of ultra running?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's two possibilities here. I think they both lead to us seeing growth in these timed events, and specifically the 24-hour. One would be like what you mentioned, some of the talent that has found the trail saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to go and try to actually spend some time and energy in figuring out how to execute a strong 24-hour. But we could also just see the sport continue to grow and people kind of come into it with the mindset of, hey, well, that's what I have access to. Perhaps maybe they don't have access to the mountains and the things that
Mm-hmm.
would really put them in a good place, because that side of the sport's gotten to a point now where race course specificity training is a lot more important than maybe it was 10 years ago. Because if you don't get it, your competition is, and the difference between the first, second, and third place people are such a small margin now. Even things that are maybe smaller movers do kind of show up on race day. So I think the other side would just be like sport grows, people enter the sport with an interest in kind of the flat, more runnable stuff. And since they have their interest there, we just see more talent and, more people capable of putting up big numbers start taking a swing at it. Uh, we're sort of seeing this in kind of some of the more European type areas where we're seeing guys hit the 180s a lot more frequently
Mm-hmm.
in that area. I'm not sure what the driver is for them targeting those events with maybe a little more rigor than what we've seen here in the U.S. over the years, but I think that's a sign. I think we'll catch up. I think we'll start seeing kind of folks enter the sport with a goal of, whether it be like, breaking my American record in the 100-mile or going after Nick Curry's 24-hour American record. And then it's like anything, right? You start kind of seeing those examples occur and you're like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And then we just kind of see those numbers start to kind of creep up to where we're starting to put up kind of historic numbers again.
Yeah, good point. And the other thing I think that kind of weighs into this um, is media, right? Like I just
Yeah.
think of no disrespect to anyone, but like I think of like World Mountain Trail Running Championships and how much media goes there to film and do this and that. And then I think of World Championships for a road event or a 24-hour event. And at least on the American side, I don't see the media showing up. So I think like that's a big driver. And I think of previous Desert Solstices. Obviously, Courtney Dauwalter was here. She has won the event. And and I don't know what Courtney's story is, but if your sponsors or media aren't incentivizing, hey, let's go run this event, and if you do something great, we're gonna incentivize you with extra money or that. I think that kind of plays a little bit of a role too on what athletes are coming here. We're gonna
Absolutely.
put you on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think you're right on. I think it's like if you're looking at some of the top mountain athletes in the sport, a lot of their contracts probably have bonuses, maybe just for showing up for like a UTMB or a Western States, where they
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily have those to go to World 24 Hours or something like that. I think the answer to that will be personal brands. So you get someone as big as Courtney Dauwalter, or anyone who decides just to build a brand around themselves, where now all of a sudden the finances are the exposure they can present versus them necessarily being at any particular event, and then they can sort of carry that weight with them from the financial side of things, and maybe have a little bit more of an open opportunity, so to speak.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Let's put him on the spot.
I'll ask.
Zach, are you having any future plans? Are we going to see you back at Desert Solstice in years to come? What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I'll definitely be back at Desert Solstice at some point in the future. Yeah, since we talked about me being there 7 times before, I'd like to at least get to 10. So
Ooh.
Nice.
got to hit double digits. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think especially once I start to like focus, I mean, my training and a lot of my energy has gone into kind of refining the 100-mile distance and duration over the years, but there will be a point where I think I just kind of skew that energy a little bit more towards the 24 hours. So at that point, when I'm picking races at the beginning of the year to sort of, maybe it's 2 that I'm really going to go after in a year, I think Desert Solstice will be a very nicely placed and put together organized event to go after like a strong 24 performance.
Awesome.
Robert. Well, we'll be here.
Yeah, we will be here. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with us. We will see you at Desert Solstice in years to come. Thanks again, Zach. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys.